Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Joan, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to Canada. I think it's a great honor also to have the first speech here. To start with, originally I wanted to offer to you the picture of a bright and progressive Europe as a true global leader in climate policy. And I have to confess, the reality is a little bit more multifaceted. And there are also some shadows, and I don't hide those shadows, but I think still in balance, what I will say is Europe is on the positive side, and I will try to explain you why this is the case. But perhaps first of all, a short word where I'm coming from. Joan has already introduced me, coming from the German Advisory Council on the Environment. This Council has been established by the federal government to give independent, and I think that is very important, independent scientific advice on environmental issues. We have a history of 44 years, and our council has a high reputation for its reliable, science-based, and sometimes also very critical assessments. We played a quite important role in the debate on the German energy transition. Our report, Pathways Towards a 100% Renewable Electricity System, was published just 6 weeks before the Fukushima accident. And after this accident, it got a tremendous public outreach and certainly helped to encourage the federal government to take the decisions for the long-term energy transition roadmap it adopted shortly afterwards. But my talk is about Europe. I would like to address 3 basic issues. The first is some basic characteristics of the EU. I know where I'm here, but I think it's nevertheless important to highlight a few characteristics as regards energy and climate policy. And my main point is it is not easy to come to an agreement in a very diverse European Union. And I think one has to be aware of those, about those differences between member states. The second point I would like to raise is the conditions which led to the Agenda 2020 decided in the year 2008, which is basically the starter of the European energy transition towards a low-carbon economy, somehow similar to the German one, even though somehow slower. What has been decided in the year 2008 was a triple target for climate, for renewables, and for energy efficiency, each one with a figure 20, a 20% reduction of greenhouse gases compared by 2020, compared to 1990, a 20% share of renewables in relation to primary energy demand, and last not least, a 20% energy efficiency a target related to the trends which were foreseen by 2020. And then I would like to compare this decision in the year 2008. I have to add one further decision which was taken by heads of government. This was a long-term objective for the European Union to reduce greenhouse gases by 80 to 95% until the year 2050. Perhaps you are aware of the G7 summit results, where there was a decision to decarbonize the economy by the year 2100. Europe has decided to go 50 years ahead, already 6 years ago. All this I want to compare with the Agenda 2030, which has been adopted last year. You just heard some details by the ambassador, which, in my view, is still going away towards a low-carbon economy, but with a weaker approach compared to what has been decided in the year 2008. So I start with the basic characteristics. The starting conditions in the European Union are not easy. Some may even be considered as barriers to a strong common approach to climate policy. Others are more helpful. I think much what I will tell you has to be understood at this background. I would say that what has been decided and approved must be a surprise for all realists in international relations. Realists in international relations never would have predicted such outcomes on the basis of such a constellation of structures and interests. As a starter, Europe has totally different energy structures and strategies in member states. To give you a few examples, there is Poland, nearly completely coal dependent and with a little political will to change this substantially. There is France, nearly completely dependent on nuclear energy, with a political will in meanwhile to change something. There are some countries with strong hydropower shares, just mentioned, Austria, Sweden as examples. There are a number of countries heading for an ambitious transition towards renewables, such as Denmark, which is the real leader in Europe, Portugal, and Germany, and a few years ago I would also name Spain as one of the countries who are going that direction, but this has changed meanwhile. And most countries, somewhere in between those extremes, most countries in the European Union now are aiming for a nuclear phase-out, and others are aiming for a nuclear renaissance, such as the United Kingdom and Finland. This gives you a rough picture of the structures in Europe. The second point is the European Union, Joan has mentioned it, is somehow a hybrid. It is nor a supranational state, neither simply a federation of states. Its competence structure is highly fragmented, and I don't go into details. But this highly fragmentation is not suitable for the consistent energy and climate strategy. Just to give you one example, the European Union is strong as regards internal market and competition-related issues, but in other issues it is weak, as regards, for instance, energy taxation or influencing national choices in the energy mix. This is a matter of national sovereignty. So the question is, what helps to overcome such structural barriers? First of all, it's the role of the European Commission, which has an institutional privilege. It is the only player who may initiate policies. And the European Commission has understood the challenges of climate change and the chances of a strong climate policy for European integration as a whole. And the European Commission tends to pick the winners and offering them a first mover advantage, simply because it is taking good practice in member states and bringing this to the European level as part of its proposals. The European Commission is also at the core of what I tend to describe as a green triangle, a pro-environment, pro-climate coalition between the Environment Council, consisting of environmental ministers, the Environmental Committee of the European Parliament, and the European Commission. And in some instances, this green triangle even has been strongly supported by heads of governments. And this creates the political momentum for the ambitious climate agenda, which I will talk about later. Last but not least, the whole negotiation machinery at the European level is aiming for agreement. There is a consensus and compromise-oriented political culture, and veto players soon get isolated and discredited. I think that is something special in federalist systems. As a consequence of all this, the European Union has developed a number of tools to govern energy and climate policies, and I listed here a few of them. The flagship is the EU emissions trading system, a market-based instrument, which is governing all CO2 emissions from the power sector and from industry, covering close to half of EU CO2 emissions. The EU has also a number of what I would describe as target-led national planning requirements, such as the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the effort sharing decision, which is covering the CO2 emissions outside of the emission trading system. And last but not least, the EU has a number of product standards which it is used for efficiency requirements. So what is the result? And I think the result is quite impressive. The European Union already has achieved 90% reduction of its greenhouse gases. This is very close to its own target for the year 2020, 5 years ahead, 6 years ahead. And perhaps this reduction is even more impressive if you compare this to GDP growth. You see Europe is a case of substantial decoupling between growth and CO2 emissions. Not all of this, to be honest, is policy-driven. There was a transformation in Eastern Europe, the changes in the UK, the economic downturn since 2008. You can also identify a considerable degree of carbon leakage to third countries. All this is also the case hidden in those figures, but nevertheless, there is also a considerable policy element in it. Give you one example of a policy element next to the emission trading system. This is the Renewables Policy. As regards renewables, the European Union is on track. Last year, it reached a share of 15% of renewables in primary energy demand, and that is simply 5% short of its 2020 target. So there is hope that it will achieve this target. To mention, this is partly also due to the German success story. Just to show you, within the last 15 years, the share of renewables in the electricity mix in Germany has been growing sixfold to a share of close to a third. Also, the 20% efficiency target is ambitious compared to the trends. What I can show you in this picture is how the European Union manages its diversity. You have an overall European target, which is here minus 13% of primary energy demand. But the commitments for the requirements, not the commitments, the requirements for individual countries differ from country to country. So there are some countries which have to do more and others who do less, but the European-wide objective is being achieved. And this is the method you find also for renewables, and that you find also for within the effort sharing decision. And that is the way to manage the diversity in Europe and nevertheless to achieve some kind of progress. I skip this. This is more methodological, and come to, let's say, the important factors which led to the 2008 decision. Very shortly. There was a Copenhagen conference in 2009, and you wanted to demonstrate leadership and credibility. That means they had to come with some deliverables to the Copenhagen conference. The Stern report, which has been published in 2007, should not be underestimated. It changed minds of political leaders in Europe simply because it translated the climate change issue into a major economic concern. Then there was public attention due to big disasters which took place a few years ago. But there was also an economic driver, the pre-crisis fuel price bubble, which showed how vulnerable a region like Europe is against increasing fuel prices, and there was a good momentum to do something against it. There was also an industrial policy momentum. At that time, a number of industries believed they can contribute something to fighting climate change. It was not only the renewables sector, but it was also the nuclear sector strongly advocated by the UK. It was also the coal sector which hoped that CCS would be a future technology, and all those were supporting an ambitious climate agenda. And as a result of all this, a powerful pro-climate coalition emerged, with the three big countries, UK, France, Germany, at the core of this coalition, but also the European Commission and the European Parliament. Just to show you one driver for the debate is how Europe is fossil fuel import dependent. It is a fuel poor region. And therefore, the fuel price increases up to the year 2008 were somehow a shock for Europe. And what you can see is the whole agenda, the climate energy agenda, was also an answer to this threat by increasing import bill. And it can be interpreted as some kind of import substituting strategy, investing into cheap domestic sources instead of importing expensive foreign sources. But renewables deployment can also be seen as a means of industrial development. What this graph shows to you is that meanwhile, many renewable sources are in the cost ranges at and below its fossil or nuclear competitors. And sometimes partly they are going below those levels. So meanwhile, one can say renewable sources are no more expensive. They have been expensive 10 years ago, but now they are competitive to fossil sources, and they are competitive to other conventional carbon neutral sources. And this is a result, let's say, of the deployment of renewables in the European market. The decrease of costs is strongest in PV. As you can see, there were cost reductions of more than 60% in the recent years. So what has changed last year? What hasn't changed, first of all, is there was another international conference ahead. That is the Paris conference. And certainly the French government, but also a number of other governments, again wanted to play the game of a credible leader in global climate negotiations. So there was a push towards another ambitious climate agenda. But there were some difficult factors. First of all, the economic crisis. And the economic crisis in Europe, which lasts now roughly 7 years, was translated basically by business-related interests into a matter of a trade-off between climate policy and competitiveness, something which has been overcome mainly in the last decade. It came back in recent years, and this contributed to a slowdown. Then the renewable energy came out of its niche, and suddenly the conventional power sector discovered that there is a tough competitor. So they started to launch campaigns against renewables, mainly on their excessive costs. But what I have shown to you beforehand shows the renewables do not have excessive costs. So the incumbents of the old sector were fighting back a little bit. Additionally, fuel prices are declining again. That increases differential cost of renewables promotion. And as a consequence of all this, you can see there is a fragile alliance of green member states. So UK didn't want to continue with the triple targets. It only wanted a climate target, but wanted to abolish a dedicated renewables target, and was very skeptic about an efficiency target. And it formed a broad coalition, mainly with Eastern European countries, to shift the agenda. And last not least, the priorities also of the new European Commission were about to change. The climate agenda was not above, but part of a broader agenda to achieve the energy union. And I would interpret the energy union as going back to the old internal market agenda. That means basically back to negative integration of markets instead of positive policy integration. And you've sensed this especially in the context of renewables policy, where the European Commission has introduced safeguards against national renewable promotion policies, which are quite critical. So, what has been decided? Just to put it in perspective, the 40% target seems to be ambitious if you compare this to the 2020 target of 20%. I'm sure. But if you compare this to that 20% reduction already has been achieved this year, the 40% target seems to be less ambitious. And if you look into the other figures that are some business as usual scenarios, you see the difference is not too big. And the main challenge remains after 2030. You can say with its 40% target, it is very ambitious in international comparison, but most of the job has to be done after 2030. And if this is a wise policy decision to shift the job for later, is kept to discussion. The renewables target is certainly of 27%, is certainly at the lower end of the scenarios and at the lower end of what is needed to achieve the long-term climate target and the renewables element of the long-term climate target. It is quite close to a business-as-usual scenario. So also by business as usual, you achieve 27% renewables. That means basically there you can identify a policy shift, less ambitious targets for renewables, and even worse, the governance system for renewables has been changed. There is only a European-wide target, but not a target given to individual member states. But if the European Union gets a European-wide target, it needs to have an instrument to promote renewables. But the European Union as such has no European-wide instrument. So basically what the new governance system for renewables will be is something what we know from the international climate negotiations is some kind of pledge and review system where basically the promotion of renewables is based on the voluntary commitments of member states. And some member states are willing to go ahead, others are not willing ahead. So the trend of convergence in Europe most probably will be reversed. And for me, this is a matter of major concern. But nevertheless, to conclude, I think despite of those shortcomings, the European Union is still a credible and ambitious climate policy leader. It has a rich portfolio of effective climate policy instruments. It has potentially strong governance mechanisms, and also renewables policy can be revitalized as the constellation improves. And to conclude, the energy transition in Europe towards a low carbon and renewable energy-based economy was slowed down by the recent decisions, but it was not stopped, so it continues. So I hope I could give you a first impression of what's happening in the European Union. Thank you.